To call the years of American history between 1783 and 1788 a difficult period is stating the case rather mildly. It was almost an impossible period. There was nominally a federal government. It had no power. There were in actuality 13 state governments, each as different as apples and oranges, each strong, autonomous, and unwilling to relinquish one iota of its power to the central government. It did not take long under this government of chaos for the very new nation that was America to begin to dissolve into a jelly of local petty feuds which left it wide open to sudden foreign attack. How did things get into such a state? It all started right before the Revolution. In 1776, the American colonies had declared themselves free and independent. The long-awaited step, dreaded by some, hoped for by others, had at last been taken. The colonies themselves, England and the rest of the world, were told that America had separated itself forever from the mother country. "We are English subjects no longer," proclaimed the Declaration of Independence in essence. "We are free of you and your taxation, your troops, your high-handed treatment, your search warrants, your trade monopolies, your king. We are not Englishmen anymore. We are Americans." This was the irrevocable step that Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and Patrick Henry had been urging upon the colonies for years. And following this daring, brash, and splendid declaration, 13 small colonies put aside their many basic disagreements to unite for a common purpose. They drove the English out of America, tea, taxes, troops, and all. In September 1783, by the Treaty of Paris, a new nation was born. It was larger than the original 13 colonies. Great Britain had recognized the independence of the United States of America as the new nation would be called, and had yielded to this new country all British territory east of the Mississippi River, except Florida. Britain also recognized the rights of Americans to fish off the banks of Newfoundland. The United States Congress existing at the time, which was the Second Continental Congress, promised Britain that it would certainly advise the various states to pay property damages suffered during the Revolutionary War to the English loyalists in America. Congress also promised it would recommend that the states pay all pre-war debts due to British merchants. Now, when the Second Continental Congress promised to advise and to recommend these things to the states, we come to a very serious drawback to the American governmental system at that time. For Congress had no power to order the states to do these things. Indeed, now that the war emergency was over, the Congress found that it had neatly tied its own hands. Congress had submitted a weak plan of government known as the Articles of Confederation. This had seemed to be rolling along pretty well in wartime, when everyone was more or less agreeing with everyone else. They all wanted two things, independence and union. What was there to disagree about? They all faced the same dangers, took the same risks, and, as John Hancock warned them, "Gentlemen, if we do not all hang together, we will most assuredly hang separately." And they had indeed hung together. The Second Continental Congress was a body of revolutionaries. Because of the war, it became a temporary governing and coordinating body, directing the efforts of each colony. It raised armies, appointed George Washington commander-in-chief, sent ministers abroad, made an alliance with France, borrowed money, issued paper money, and, unfortunately, bound the nation to the Articles of Confederation. It would be difficult to think of a more constricting, inept, or demoralizing plan for a government than these articles. Here are just a few of the major weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. 1. There was no president to see that the laws were obeyed. 2. Congress could not pass a tax law to raise money. 3. Congress had no power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. 4. Congress had no power to regulate trade between the states. In fact, Congress had no real power as a body at all. For a while, nobody did, and for 4 long years, things were rather hectic in the new country, so proudly independent, full of great and wise statesmen, and bursting at the seams to get up and get going. But for those 4 years, they weren't going anywhere. Troubles boiled up on every side. Unpaid soldiers marched to Philadelphia where Congress was in session to demand their pay. Congress, powerless to raise a cent to meet its current expenses or pay interest on the national debt, did not even have the power to handle the riots staged by these angry soldiers in 1783. Everywhere there was dissatisfaction, armed uprisings, boundary disputes, tariff wars. And this in a very critical time when the one thing that was desperately needed was a strong central government. But the Articles of Confederation created not a unified nation at all, but a loosely strung together league of states, and each did pretty much as it wanted. In theory, the states shared their authority with Congress, in which each state had one vote, but the states completely overshadowed Congress. Some of the state governments printed paper money which had little value. There was no gold backing it up. Money issued by New Jersey was not accepted as money in New York, and each of the states, acting as if it were a nation and a law unto itself, began to charge import duties, taxes, and tolls on goods being sent from one state to another. Farmers could not pay their debts. They were in danger of losing their homes and of going to prison. The state governments, raising all of their money by taxation, taxed heavily. The farmers had no money to pay. Congress had no power. It could not enforce the laws it passed, for there was no judicial system under the Articles. It was very difficult for Congress to pass any important laws because they had to have the approval of 9 states. And it was utterly impossible to amend the Articles because this required the consent of all the states. And during those 4 years, all of the states were not even on speaking terms with each other most of the time. New York and New Hampshire wrangled incessantly about their borderlines. Massachusetts and Connecticut were embroiled in tariff disputes. The bitter quarrels between Virginia and Maryland over control of navigable waters were so heated that the entire Union, flimsy as it was, threatened to dissolve. Led by Daniel Shay, Massachusetts farmers rebelled and demanded that the collection of debts be stopped. Shay was a captain in the Revolution and had become a leader of and spokesman for the Western Massachusetts farmers. Shay demanded an immediate issue of large amounts of paper money, the abolition of the Massachusetts Court of Common Pleas, and a radical reduction of taxes. At 4 separate towns, including Concord, armed mobs rioted and prevented the state courts from sitting. In spite of a force of 600 state militiamen sent against them, Shay and his followers broke up a session of the State Supreme Court at Springfield, September 1786. The governor of Massachusetts raised an army to put down the farmers' rebellion. Governor Bowdoin organized a force of 4,400 troops under the command of General Benjamin Lincoln. On January 25th, 1787, Shay, with 2,000 men, marched into Springfield to seize an arsenal there, but was stopped. His force was dispersed, but word of the chaotic condition of the American government was seeping out to the rest of the world. A Congress unable to get the support of its own people could hardly hope for respect abroad. Spain and England ignored our requests for trade agreements. Spain closed the mouth of the Mississippi River to American shipping, and Spanish officials in Florida did nothing to stop Indian raids across the border into Georgia. But perhaps most ignominious of all America's troubles was the fact that the English refused to give up their northwest forts and trading posts, because, they said, America had not lived up to the provisions of the Treaty of Paris and paid the private debts due British businessmen and dispossessed loyalists. More and more people began to realize that the Articles of Confederation would have to be changed. The new nation was facing a complete breakdown of all semblance of law and order at home, plus the possibility of foreign interference. Not all of the world's powers were as willing as France to pat young America on the back and wish her well. Many powers were just waiting for the country to crumble so that they might step in and take over. England, indeed, never quite gave up this hope, up to and including the Civil War, when she aided the South in secret. At Washington's urging, Alexander Hamilton suggested a meeting of the state's delegates at Philadelphia to consider ways of strengthening the national government. Delegates were selected to attend a convention to change the Articles of Confederation. 55 men, representing every state except Rhode Island, gathered together in 1787. It was to be an enormous undertaking. Many of the delegates were personal enemies as well as political opponents. Many came solely interested in the good of their own states and were prepared to stand pat and not give an inch on anything. The great statesman and orator Patrick Henry of Virginia refused to come at all, as did Samuel Adams and Richard Henry Lee. So strongly did they oppose any centralization of government. Thomas Jefferson was not there, but serving as minister to France at the time. John Adams was in England, but there were many who came determined to save what had been so dearly bought. Best known and most popular delegate was George Washington of Virginia. He was chairman of the convention. He had been trying for years to get something done to knit the various factions together. He had met with many leaders at his home in Mount Vernon in an attempt to organize just such a convention. Washington, a Federalist, was one of the chief supporters of the Constitution which was finally drafted. James Madison was a delegate also. He came to be known as the father of the Constitution. It was due to his influence that the Bill of Rights was written and adopted as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. A fellow Virginian, Edmund Randolph, also attended the convention as the spokesman. Pennsylvania chose 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin as its leading delegate. It was because of his wisdom and never-failing tact and diplomacy that many of the great compromises were accepted. Franklin, who took part in America's struggle for independence from the beginning, opposed the Federalists and their centralizing policies. He was also opposed to slavery, and his last public act was to petition Congress in 1790 for the immediate abolition of slavery and suppression of the slave trade. Alexander Hamilton was one of the delegates from New York. Hamilton, a Federalist, was the strong advocate of centralization of power. Together with James Madison and John Jay, he was to produce the Federalist Papers, a series of essays explaining the new Constitution. The delegates met in Philadelphia at the State House, which is known as Independence Hall. From the beginning, disagreements were numerous, debates were sharp, delegates were stubborn. A division in the general thinking of the nation made itself plain, and the same division of opinion exists up to today. It boiled down to states' rights versus strong centralized federal power. Of course, there were many areas in which they were all in agreement. They had learned the hard way that Congress must have the power to tax and to regulate trade. They knew they must create a strong executive and a separate judicial system. They realized that there must be full protection of property rights. But they were there only to revise the Articles of Confederation. None of these so necessary improvements were at all possible, no matter how they would rearrange, add to, or attempt to get around the Articles. It was seen quite early that a new plan of government would have to be drawn up.
But what was it to be? There were issues that seemed insoluble. Between large states and small states, between slave states and free states, between agricultural states and industrial states. They had to somehow achieve a delicate balance of power between the rights of the sovereign state governments and the national government. It seemed impossible to please everyone.
Many compromises had to be made before a new plan of government was completed. The Virginia plan, put forth by the large states, proposed that representation in Congress be based on population. The small states balked at this, and in the New Jersey plan, they demanded equal voting power for all states. The Connecticut Compromise actually did manage to please everybody by providing for 2 houses of Congress, each state to have 2 seats in the Senate, and to be represented according to population in the House of Representatives. And so it went, issue by issue, until every problem had been, if not solved, then settled. Probably one of the major compromises was on the question of centralization of power. The convention created a federal union in which important powers were delegated to the central government, all other powers being reserved to the states or the people. The work of writing the Constitution was completed on September 17th, 1787. The men who framed it were lawyers, politicians, and businessmen. They were remarkably clear-sighted thinkers on the theory and practice of government. Their work has endured, with some technical changes, for nearly 200 years. Our Constitution is the oldest written constitution in the world and has served as a model for many other nations. The Constitution was a fairly conservative plan of government based on lessons learned from the past. The delegates who put it together allowed for great flexibility and growth. Washington was the first delegate to sign his name to the Constitution. On September 17, 1787, altogether 39 of the 55 delegates signed in the names of the states they represented. All that lay ahead now was that the states should accept what they had decided upon. It was agreed that when 9 states had accepted the new plan of government, it would go into effect among them. And then the fight began between the Federalists, who backed the new plan, and the states' rightists, small farmers and laborers who were against it. The Federalists presented a positive program. They had Washington's support, and their pledge that a written Bill of Rights would be added to the Constitution as soon as it was adopted won many doubtful votes. On July 2nd, 1788, Congress announced that 9 states had accepted the Constitution and that it would go into effect soon. Delaware was the first state to ratify. North Carolina did not enter the Union until months after Washington's inauguration as president, and Rhode Island held out until May of 1790. Now, let's see how well you remember. Here's a list of 6 statements, one of which is false. See if you can spot the false statement. 1. The Articles of Confederation produced an unsatisfactory form of government. 2. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government wielded too much centralized power. 3. Dissatisfaction and unrest resulted from the government under the Articles. 4. A convention met in Philadelphia to change the Articles. 5. It was soon realized that an entirely new plan of government would have to be devised. 6. The result of discussion and of compromises was the Constitution of the United States. Did you spot the false statement? Here are the correct ones. Things to remember. 1. The Articles of Confederation produced an unsatisfactory form of government. 2. Dissatisfaction and unrest resulted from the government under the Articles. 3. A convention met in Philadelphia to change the Articles. 4. It was soon realized that an entirely new plan of government would have to be devised. 5. The result of discussion and of compromises was the Constitution of the United States. Number 2 in the first list was false. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government wielded too much centralized power. is wrong. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government had very little centralized power is correct. The basic principles and specific provisions of the Constitution are derived from many sources. England herself had given our first statesmen many of their ideas of personal liberty, representative government, security of property rights, and an independent system of courts. English common laws, those traditions which were part of the people's lives, although never written down, played an important part in the framing of America's Constitution. Another source of political concepts used by American statesmen were the writings of political theorists and analysts, such as the English philosopher John Locke and the French author Montesquieu. Probably more important than any theoretical ideas of government was the practical experience the colonists had gotten while ruling themselves under colonial charters. And then, of course, there were the hard lessons they had learned while trying to piece together a functioning government. All the weaknesses and impracticalities of the Articles of Confederation served some purpose after all. The really significant point about the final adoption of the new Constitution was not that the radical change in government was made with some reluctance and doubts, but that it was made voluntarily and peacefully.